네, 안녕하세요. 2024년 제1회 학습과학연구소 세미나 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 지금 줌으로도 많이 들어오고 계신데요. 오늘 연사분께서 외국인이신 관계로 전체 진행은 영어로 진행을 좀 해보도록 하겠습니다. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Learning Sciences Research Institute at Seoul National University, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you guys. Thank you for joining us today. As part of our ongoing efforts to promote interdisciplinary research in learning, our research institute hosts a lot of series and symposiums and seminars featuring international scholars. So today, the Learning Science Research Institute at Seoul National University is proud to present the first seminar of 2024 titled Cognitive Brain Health and Functioning in Others, Performing at Our Best. So we are honored to have with us Professor Liana Machado from the Department of Psychology at the University of Otago, New Zealand. Professor Machado received her doctorate degree in neuroscience from UC Davis and spent 5 years as a postdoctoral research at Bangor University in the UK. And her research focused on the mechanism underlying healthy cognitive function, cognitive deficits resulting from aging and brain disorders, and methods to improve cognitive function through exercise and diet. In today's seminar, Professor Machado will discuss the effects of aging and brain damage on cognition functioning and the impact of COVID-19 and effective method to enhance cognitive abilities. So she will focus on lifestyle factors related to brain health and cognitive improvement with an emphasis on physical activity. So please make a big applause for our presenter, Professor Machado, today.
Okay, so thank you so much for inviting me out. I've been absolutely loving Seoul. I've never been to such a big city with so many mountains around it, so it's very beautiful. I live in New Zealand, so I don't have a pointer, but I can point with the mouse, right? So I live in New Zealand, in this part of New Zealand on the South Island. And our population is only about 125,000. So it's a very big city for me. And this is the North Island here. And hopefully some of you might like to come out and visit at some time, but I'll talk about that at the end. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about a variety of things, such as how your brain changes as you grow older. On a cognitive level, as well as related to the functional organization of the brain. So the brain parts that you use when you're thinking or engaging in particular cognitive tasks. And I'm also going to talk about some changes with brain disease, but mostly I am going to focus on positive sides. So things we can do to perform a bit better, not just when we're older, but also as 20-year-olds, as university students who are near their developmental peak. But there's, for many people, still some room for improvement to perform a bit better. So we'll talk about some of the things you can do. And I'm also going to weave in a couple of recent studies we ran that tie into the pandemic. So there's a couple of studies that have an interrelationship, but at the same time are a little bit different, but they relate to the COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, and just for your information, yes, I'm in psychology and also the neuroscience program at University of Otago. Okay, let me make sure I've got these right. Not that one. Not that one. Do I have to point it this way, maybe? Just try it that. Otherwise, I can press the down button. Ah, yeah. Which one was it? The bottom. Okay. Okay. So during early development, so this graph is starting at age 10 on the bottom here. And during early development, our cognitive functions are still developing. And for most cognitive functions, they tend to peak in our early 20s. And then unfortunately, given most humans live for a long time these days, it's a long period of decline. It's a normal part of aging, and it's something that we all go through. But as I said, even near the peak, we're going to see what things can be done to help us perform even better still near the peak. But a fair bit, I will also talk about aging, right? So I think I'm pointing it the wrong way. Oh, yeah, no, it works. Okay. Okay, so as we grow older and you see that cognitive decline starting kind of roughly around your 30s or so, what you see also is a decline in the structure of the brain. So on the left here, you have my brain when I was in my 20s. And what you see here are the ventricles. So central to the brain, you have the lateral ventricles, and they're just a space, and the brain tissue presses into it. And you can see that they look small on the left brain. And then you look at the older brain in about age 65, and you see they look much bigger, the space there. And that's because the tissue is declining. So the tissue is deteriorating. That's a normal part of aging. And that means that the ventricles look bigger because the tissue isn't pressing so hard into it. And that's a normal part of aging. And alongside these declines in the tissue of the brain, we also see declines in brain blood flow. So it's perfectly normal. This is young, middle age, and older adults. And it's perfectly normal that as we grow older, our blood flow declines. So if you look at the hot colors are at the top, for example, yellow and red. And as you look across these brains, you see less and less on the outer parts where the cerebral cortex is, you see less and less of the hot colors. And that's because you have a dampening of cerebral blood flow, which is perfectly normal with aging. And in addition to that, I might just press this if it works. Oh, yeah, that works. In addition to that, we also have some changes in the responsiveness of our blood supply system. So when you start thinking, your neurons start firing and they need resources. So blood needs to rush into the area to supply them with resources. And that's a normal response. But as we get older, the response, it's a little bit attenuated, not quite as good as when we're in our 20s. So that's a normal thing. And also when we get exposed to elevated levels of carbon dioxide. So for example, when you go for a walk in Seoul and it's quite a smoggy, a lot of pollution that day, you need your blood flow to speed up to flush that out. It's a normal response that your blood system should do. But as we get older, it's attenuated a little bit, not as good as when we're young. So we have all these changes going on related to the tissue of the brain and also the blood supply system. And also alongside these things going on is we also end up at higher risk of brain diseases. So there's a variety of neurological diseases that are tied to aging, for example, stroke. And you can see here in these scans, this is somebody who has had a stroke involving their visual cortex in one hemisphere. And you can see it within each of these slides. And that causes the person not to be able to see on the opposite side of that lesion. In addition to stroke risk going up as we grow older, we also have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. And each of these come with their own adverse impact on cognition. So for example, with Parkinson's disease, although it's often thought of as a motor disease because it's most obvious if you see someone with Parkinson's disease, you can see that their walk is not typical and you can pick up on the motor symptoms, but there are actually a lot of cognitive symptoms going on as well. So what we're going to be focusing on as we move on is what kinds of things we can do to improve the situation a bit. Another thing that happens is that the functional organization of the brain changes a bit. So even with healthy aging, not only do you see a decline in the brain tissue, but we also see changes in the way the brain responds when we engage in cognitive activities. So I'm going to show you 3 tasks that I'm going to talk about a fair bit. So we'll just see if I could get these to play. This is the easiest task. It's just a basic visual motor task. So you see something and you make a motor response. So sorry, I don't have 2 hands because I'm holding this microphone, but you're just pressing with your index finger on the side of the green square. It's a very easy task. People usually don't make many mistakes. And all you have to do is press, as quickly as you can without making errors on the side of the green square. The square is always green, and we're measuring how quickly you can do that without making any mistakes. And so, oops, I made a mistake. And so that gives us a measure of how quickly you could do visual motor processing to press a button. But very easy, doesn't really involve any cognitive. Okay. It doesn't really involve any cognitive control or anything. It's certainly not an executive function task, meaning it doesn't involve that higher level cognition. In contrast, this task is a little bit more challenging. In this case, the square is always red, and your task is to always press on the side opposite the square. You're not allowed to press on the same side as the square. You must always inhibit that response and instead respond on the opposite side. So this task is requiring a bit of inhibitory control, which is one of our executive functions or higher level cognitive functions. And with older adults, sometimes they make mistakes and they press on the same side. But even when they get it correct, they're much slower. And I'll show you that data in a second. And then finally, the third task, which involves the green and the red squares, so it requires some mental flexibility. So you're supposed to respond on the same side as green squares, but whenever the square is red, then you have to respond on the opposite side. So you have to switch back and forth between those task demands. And so it involves a bit of mental flexibility. And this is where older adults have even more trouble. So they tend to make more mistakes, but even if you ask them, please don't make mistakes, try to get it always right, then their responses are a lot slower in order to get it correct and not make a mistake. And they don't know each time whether the square will be red or green. And what you see down here are the performance deficits in the older adults relative to the young adults. And you can see that's going up as you move from the easy visual motor task, where it's always green and you press on the same side, to the one that requires inhibitory control because it's always red and you have to press on the opposite side, to the one that involves switching back and forth between green and red, and then you have the most slowing. And alongside that, what we're looking at here, so this is near-infrared spectroscopy. I'll just show you on the next slide real quick and come back. So near-infrared spectroscopy, you have probes, and it's measuring in an elliptical path between the two probes from the tissue. So you're measuring concentrations of oxygenated hemoglobin, deoxygenated hemoglobin, and total hemoglobin. I'm mostly going to focus on oxygenated hemoglobin because it's most commonly used as an indicator that that brain area was activated or the neurons started firing when you were doing that cognitive task. But sometimes I'll talk a little bit about total too, which is an indicator of blood volume. So it gives you an idea that blood rushed into that area and the blood volume increased. It's basically just oxygenated hemoglobin plus deoxygenated hemoglobin. And what you see here, if you look first at the young adults, is it's always blue or green. So you don't see activation going on. This is just underlying the forehead, so the far frontal region, the far part of the frontal lobe, just underlying your forehead. Whereas you see in the older adults, activation, especially as the task gets harder. So it moves from green to yellow to red, and you see more and more activation as the task gets harder. So not only do you see a difference in their performance where they're having more difficulties, but you also see that they're activating this brain region underlying the forehead that the young people are not activating. So they have a different hemodynamic response to the same task, the same cognitive task. And just go on to the next slide. This is a graph of the same data we just looked at. And what we found was for the hardest task where you saw the most activation or the highest increase in oxygenated hemoglobin in the older adults, we found that that data correlated with performance for the hardest task. So that's for the hardest task. And if you looked at their performance, there was a correlation. And that gives us the indication that people who were activating that far anterior region of the frontal lobe appear to be performing better. So that suggests that that's a compensatory area. So as we grow older and the brain's deteriorating, it kind of makes sense that you might need to recruit new areas and to make up for the areas deteriorating. And so you see more activation going on further forward towards the forehead. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. It's still focusing on near-infrared spectroscopy. So using the same general tool, although it wasn't this particular device because we just ran the study last year and we have new equipment, but it's still the same idea where you're recording from tissue. And again, we're focused on probes overlying the forehead. And the reason why we do that is because there's no hair there. So the hair can attenuate the signal from the near infrared spectroscopy from the probes. And so it's you get cleaner data if you record from a site without hair. And so what we did was we recruited undergraduate students. So these are mostly students in their 20s studying at the University of Otago. And we asked them if they've had COVID-19 or not. So we're interested in whether we might see any differences on a cognitive level or on a hemodynamic level in terms of the functional organization of the brain if you've had COVID-19 before or you have not. Now, as it turned out, perhaps not surprisingly, most people said, yeah, I've had it. So that was self-report. We asked them to report that they had it only if they'd had a positive rapid antigen test that confirmed that their claim. And only 19 said they didn't have it yet. So that's quite a small group, unfortunately, without. But to our surprise, we did find a difference, actually. So recording from the brain area underlying the forehead, we found a significant difference in both oxygenated hemoglobin and total hemoglobin, such that compared to resting baseline, which is what we're always looking at. So you're always looking at change compared to resting baseline. You see a lot less negative change in people who have had it compared to those who hadn't. So possibly looking a little bit more like the older adults, but it's not positive change. It's just a different pattern, less of a negative change. It's not entirely clear what it means, but the pattern is the same for oxygenated hemoglobin and total hemoglobin, which help confirm for us that it seems a bit reliable, if you know what I mean. Incidentally, here I only showed you oxygenated hemoglobin, but if I'd showed you total hemoglobin, that gives you more of an indication of blood volume. The pattern actually looks the same. So I didn't show you both just to be efficient, but the total hemoglobin looks basically the same as oxygenated hemoglobin changes. And that's what we found here as well. And those undergraduates who said they had previous COVID-19 infection versus not. Looks very similar across the two. Only then when we looked at by hemisphere, we realized it's only going on in the right hemisphere. So if you look at those who said that they had COVID-19 previously versus not in the left hemisphere, for both oxy and total, they look basically identical. It's only in the right hemisphere that you see a clear difference. So not entirely sure what it means yet. On the bright side, there was no cognitive performance deficits at a group level. So at a group level, there was no clear difference in cognitive performance between the 19 who said that they have not had COVID-19 versus the 75 who said they had. So that was encouraging that there was no obvious cognitive difficulties. Although when you look at an individual level, there did seem to be some people who've had COVID-19 that were struggling. But we'd need to run a much larger sample study to get a better idea of that. So yes, we see these hemodynamic changes just in the right hemisphere, but no clear cognitive deficits, but perhaps some individuals appeared to be having difficulty. But again, not a big enough sample size to be too confident about that, I think. In terms of the tests, I forgot to mention that in addition to the tests that I showed you, assessing basic vision motor performance, inhibitory control, mental flexibility, we also included some selective attention tests and also short-term and working memory tests. So working memory, for example, would be, I don't know if anyone plays golf here, but I've played a fair bit of golf in my life, and you have to add up all the numbers at the end. So mental arithmetic is an example of working memory where you have to add something up in your head, or you have to juggle a bunch of information in your head. All the time when you're studying or you're doing things, or even just having a conversation, usually you're juggling some information in your head. Oftentimes in a conversation, you might be referring back to some information that your friend told you earlier and combining it with some new information. And that's all part of things that go on in working memory. So we didn't see any clear deficits at a group level for these basic cognitive control mechanisms or executive functions, which is good. In case you're interested, of the 75 who reported having previously had COVID, 40% said that they had brain fog at the time. And we didn't see a clear relationship between the people who said they had brain fog when they had COVID-19 versus, say, these hemodynamic changes or the individuals who appeared to have cognitive difficulties. So we haven't made any clear connection about that, which I think is encouraging because I appreciate a lot of people suffered brain fog when they had COVID-19. And I guess it's encouraging to think that you might not have any long-term cognitive difficulties. But given that we are seeing some individuals who look like they might be having difficulties on a cognitive level, and definitely group level differences in the right hemisphere in terms of the hemodynamic response, we're still thinking that it's possible, because these were healthy university students, it's possible that people who have, say, asthma or some kind of respiratory difficulties, or maybe are just older adults who already have a bit of cognitive deterioration going on, it's possible that we need to tap into some more vulnerable populations to see how they are doing, because they might be struggling a little bit more. These were healthy university students. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about some of the positive things we might be able to do in terms of boosting cognition. My lab has tried a number of things, some dietary interventions. It turned out people didn't like beetroot bread very much, even though beetroot's very healthy for your blood supply system as well. And we've tried brain stimulation. But what I want to focus on today is exercise. So engaging in physical activity and the benefits for cognition and brain functioning after engaging in physical activity. So the basic idea here, now my lab only tests adults. So we don't test children in my lab, but I can tell you that children can certainly benefit as well, even though my lab doesn't research that. So I'm going to focus on a combination of young adults, university students, and also older adults. And the idea is to try to boost their cognitive functioning and try to basically make a nicer trajectory so that people are performing a bit better on a cognitive level. And although we're focusing mostly on cognition, I'll also talk a bit about mood. We'll also talk a bit about how people are feeling, positive and negative moods. So we've been finding that throughout adulthood, there is room for improvement, or at least that's what our data is indicating. And fortunately, it hasn't been restricted to high intensity physical activity. In some cases, higher intensity has been more helpful, but we've been finding indications that even just brisk walking can be helpful. So for people who aren't interested in high intensity exercise, which is actually a lot of people are put off by high intensity exercise, especially older adults, they might be worried about getting injured. We're finding that even brisk walking can be quite helpful. And we're also finding alongside labs overseas that older adults tend to benefit a bit more, not too surprising given that they clearly have more room for improvement given the normal decline that occurs. So older adults tend to benefit a wee bit more. And fortunately, it seems to be more about what they do in older age than what they had done when they were younger. So for those of us who are already a bit older, if you're thinking, oh, I was a bit of a couch potato when I was in my 30s, am I going to be able to make up for that? Our data is suggesting at least that it really is more about what you're doing kind of today, not what you were doing 20 years ago. So for those of us who are getting into exercise at an older age, it looks like that's a good idea and can still be quite helpful. We've also been finding, as have other labs, that you tend to see more improvements related to more challenging cognitive tests. So when you're looking at tests that involve executive functioning, a lot more control processes, not necessarily as much benefit for basic visual-motor performance type tasks. So we tend to see more benefits for the harder tasks. And some of what we looked at as well is the potential of vascular functioning to be one of the factors that might support better cognitive performance in relation to chronic exercise. And I'll also talk a bit about acute exercise. So when I talk about chronic exercise, I'm talking about, for example, like your regular exercise habits over, say, the last 6 months. So chronic over a long period. But later on, I'll talk a bit about acute exercise benefits. So for example, if you just went for a jog or you just engage in some physical activity, what are the short-term gains that you might be able to get as well? Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about relationships with vascular functioning. And I'm going to introduce a new tool, transcranial Doppler ultrasound. So this is my colleague, Sam Lucas, and we're insunating his right middle cerebral artery through the temporal window there. And the middle cerebral artery irrigates this portion of the brain, indicated in blue here. And we're interested in measuring, using this transcranial Doppler ultrasound device, measuring how fast the blood is flowing. So what's the blood flow velocity in the middle cerebral artery? And in particular, we're interested in the responsiveness of the system. So I talked about that early on. If you go out on a smoggy day and you're exposed to elevated levels of carbon dioxide, you want your blood flow to speed up. Well, we didn't have people go out in the smog. Instead, we had them breathing in elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the laboratory. And we also had them hyperventilating or breathing quickly to have unusually lowered levels of carbon dioxide, in which case their blood supply system or velocity should slow down. And we're looking at what is the relationship between how responsive your vascular system is to your exercise habits. We also, in a separate study, looked at near-infrared spectroscopy, which we've already talked about before. So even though the picture is here, we're actually recording here. And in this particular study, we only tested females, female university students, and we only recorded from the right hemisphere. And it's not, well, it is true that the right hemisphere tends to be a bit more important for executive functions like inhibitory control, but the main reason is not interesting. The other probes weren't working so well, so we decided not to risk noisy data, and we went with the probes that were working very well, and the hemisphere that we were quite sure is involved in the cognitive tests. So it happened to only be the right hemisphere there. And what we found with the transcranial Doppler ultrasound is, yes, we found exercise cognition relationships. So people who were chronically exercising more frequently, this was self-report though, people who said they were really regularly engaging in exercise performed better, particularly on the harder tasks, the anti-task and the pro-anti-task, where you had that combination of first inhibitory control, and then you have a bit of mental flexibility and switching back and forth between the task demands. We saw a relationship there, and it appeared to be mediated through this pathway of their cerebrovascular responsiveness. So it's a correlational study, so this is just statistical magic to see the mediation. People who said they were exercising more regularly had a stronger vascular response to those changes in carbon dioxide levels, and they also performed better on the more challenging cognitive tests. Statistically, that regulation of vascular flow appeared to be a mediator of that. But that was only in the young adults. In the older adults, we saw the exercise cognition relationships, but they did not appear to be mediated by their responsiveness of their vascular system. So I'm not quite sure if that's just because as we get older, that response does break down a bit. So maybe it's just becoming noisier. I'm not sure. And then you don't see a strong relationship, but we didn't pick up on this being a mediator of the exercise cognition relationship in the older adults. In terms of the near-infrared spectroscopy, again, this one's in just young women. And what we found was that people who exercise more regularly tended to have a higher, less negative change, you might say, underlying the forehead on the right side, as I mentioned in this particular study. So this is the average of the whole group. But those who exercise more frequently, or reported exercising more frequently, tended to have less negative change compared to those who weren't exercising very much. And we also found that less negative change, basically, in those who were exercising more frequently, that was related to their performance as well. So it gave some indication that having more oxygen availability in your brain might put you in a better physiological state for responding on a cognitive level and help you to perform better, particularly for the most difficult or challenging task. If you look at the group, instead of looking at, in this case, all 52 young women at the same time, these are university students. If you instead separate out the ones who said they were chronically active, so exercising, say, at least 5 days a week over the last 6 months, that's these people. And you see they didn't show a negative change in oxygenated hemoglobin. Whereas those who reported being chronically inactive, which was only 6, you see quite a big negative change comparatively. So again, giving you this indication that if you're not exercising much, your brain's not in a very good physiological state to support your neurons firing and therefore support cognition. Or we can just look at the cartoon version. Basically, if you're a bit of a couch potato, you may find that your brain's a bit deprived in terms of oxygen, so not very supportive for neural functioning or cognitive functioning. Whereas if you exercise quite regularly, you may find that your brain's in quite a good physiological state, has all the oxygen it needs comparatively, and can perform well cognitively. Okay, so this is a little bit of a shift, but in relation to oxygen availability, I just have to give you a little bit of background. So what happened during the pandemic? You might have heard New Zealand, we don't have any land border countries, and we shut our borders and we kept COVID out for a long time. So we didn't have any mask mandates because we didn't have any COVID. We just didn't let any people in the country. But meanwhile, overseas, including where I grew up in Los Angeles, they were bringing in mask mandates because there was a lot of COVID-19. And there were mass protests going on in the streets. People were very angry. They weren't accustomed to masks and they were afraid of them. And so people were really expressing a lot of anger about having to wear a mask instituted by the government. And so we thought, okay, well, we don't have to wear a mask because we don't have any COVID-19 here. And in New Zealand, people don't wear masks, so nobody's normally wearing a mask. So let's see what happens. What are they so worried about? Is anything happening? So we asked people to come into the lab 2 times, 1 week apart. It's a randomized controlled trial with a counterbalance order of session. So everybody does a control session where they don't wear a mask, and everybody does a session where they wear a mask. On the day where they're supposed to wear a mask, we ask them to wear it for about 8 hours. So we want to see if you wear the mask for the whole day, and then at the end of the day, you come into the lab and you do some cognitive testing and also some mood testing. We ask them some questions about how they're feeling, which I'll explain in a second. And you're still wearing the mask. Can we see any differences in those same people compared to the control session where they didn't wear the mask at all that day? And again, we didn't ask them to risk themselves because there was no COVID-19 at that time. So it was no risk. Okay. And this is the cognitive results. So we did a variety of tests, the 3 that we already talked about. And then we also did some a selective attention task here and a selective attention task at the end here. And then these are short-term memory and working memory. So short-term memory capacity and also working memory here tests. You don't need to know a lot about the details, but basically we're trying to get a fairly broad spectrum of cognitive abilities. And what we found was in all cases on a group level, people performed a little bit worse numerically on the day that they were wearing the mask and that they were still wearing the mask during testing. So you can see the numbers always go down, which means it's worse, but it was only statistically significant in 1 case. This is the hard version of a selective attention task where they were statistically worse on the day that they wore the mask compared to the control day where they didn't wear a mask. So overall, a little bit concerning that they all went down. So maybe there's something going on there, but at the same time, encouraging that it was only in 1 case that there was significantly worse performance. So that's good. In terms of mood, though, we saw a couple of significant effects. So here's a mood scale. It's an example of the tense scale, which is this one. So there were 6 different moods, and they always get a scale like this. And we're asking, how are you feeling right now? So again, on the mask day, they're still wearing the mask, and on the control day, they're not wearing a mask. And they just mark on the line, there's 101 clickable spaces about how tense they're feeling. So I'm giving a talk, so I'll say I'm like a little bit tense maybe, although I don't feel too tense, but I'll just say I am. And you click there. And what we found was in all cases, positive mood was a bit lower and negative mood was a bit higher on the mask day compared to the control. But it was only in 2 cases that it was statistically different. So it was only that people felt significantly less happy and significantly more tense. But numerically, they all went in that direction again, like I talked about with the cognitive. And what that kind of tells me is, although mostly it wasn't too significant, it's a little concerning because then you think, okay, well, what if I'm an older adult or I have a little bit of cognitive impairment and I'm already struggling? Then maybe we need to look at those people separately to see if it's causing any adverse effects for them, because they might be a little bit more vulnerable to whatever adverse effect there is. And when you think about mood, you might think, well, actually, I already have an anxiety disorder. And so you might want to then know, okay, well, is it making me even more tense, or is it causing me any problems to make it worse or not? So I think a next step would be to try to take a closer look at some vulnerable populations to see if we're seeing much in terms of adverse effects. But overall, it didn't seem too bad in healthy university students. And of course, also people with respiratory difficulties. For example, if you already have asthma or another respiratory difficulty, it's possible that you would respond more strongly to wearing the mask. So important to check people who are vulnerable as well. But mostly in terms of healthy university students, not too many adverse effects. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a bit again, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about New Zealand in terms of our physical activity habits, or inactivity, unfortunately. So it's not part of what I'm talking about directly, but unfortunately, New Zealand's one of the most obese countries in the world. And we also perform very poorly when it comes to taking government guidelines, at least 30 minutes, at least 5 days a week of physical activity. The bottom line is, looking just at New Zealand adults, most people are not meeting it. A lot of people aren't meeting it. And in particular, women tend not to meet it, but actually men still are having a lot of trouble. But unfortunately, insufficient physical activity is even more common amongst women in New Zealand. And if you look at people who are defined as inactive, which means less than 30 minutes of physical activity per week, so that's very little, of New Zealand adults, it's 1 in 8. So a lot of people basically aren't doing any exercise in New Zealand. And then if you move on to older adults, unfortunately, the numbers get worse. So it is common, I think, in many countries that as you get older, you do a little less exercise. But when you already have such a low baseline, unfortunately, it's not great to do even less exercise. So the numbers have basically all gotten worse, with, again, females performing worse. So a lot more females not meeting the recommended guidelines of at least 30 minutes, at least 5 days a week. And also more older adults who are actually inactive, doing less than 30 minutes total exercise a week. It's actually just over 20% of older adults in New Zealand. So that's really a lot. What are some of the factors? Well, older age, also lower or higher deprivation, I should say, meaning, like, for example, lower socioeconomic status or income. Also poorer health, lower education. The more recent year, because the numbers have been getting worse over time as we move closer to today, being female, as I already mentioned, and also being unemployed, which is perhaps not surprising. If you have a job to go to each day, perhaps it's natural to engage in more physical activity just going to and from work. So these are some other numbers that are kind of giving you a similar idea from the World Health Organization. So these are overall adults in New Zealand with insufficient physical activity, meaning not meeting the at least 30 minutes, at least 5 days a week. And again, more females doing insufficient physical activity. And the numbers getting worse as you move closer in time to today. In South Korea as well, you see not as bad as New Zealand, but you still see a lot of people with insufficient physical activity. New Zealand, though, placed 13th worst out of the 161 countries in this particular study. So we really aren't doing very well, despite we're surrounded by mountains in New Zealand and there's paths to exercise on everywhere, but we're not doing very well. It's very much a car society in New Zealand. People like to drive cars a lot and don't get engaged in enough walking. This is a different study that I saw on South Korea specifically, and it was indicating that insufficient physical activity amongst adults is at about 54%, but in adolescents, they seem to think it was about 94%. I thought, well, that's ridiculously high. I took a look at another study and they give a slightly less grim number, but even still about 75%. So when you think about young people having anxiety, mood disorders, even suicide and things like that, it's probably not helping much if they're not engaging in enough physical activity. And now it's pretty well known that physical inactivity is a preventable risk factor for lots of age-related neurological diseases, like what I've been talking about: stroke, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. And if you engage in regular physical activity, it's associated with a lower risk of these age-related neurological diseases. So if you're trying to avoid a stroke or developing Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease, then regular physical activity is helpful. And so we decided, okay, well, let's try some randomized control trials and see if we can get people exercising. And what we decided to do is to go with stair climbing. Now, a common source of falls, I'm guessing in South Korea as well, I think kind of, well, in most, say, cities where you have a lot of stairwells, I guess not in the country necessarily as much, a common source of falls amongst older adults are negotiating stairs. So we figured that if we could get people doing stair climbing regularly from a young age and carrying it on as part of their exercise, that might also be a way to help prevent falls when they're getting older. But this is just in university students. So this is 32 university students. Again, it's a randomized control trial with a crossover design. So we have them come in twice, separated by 1 week. And the only difference between the two sessions is in one case, for one of the visits, we asked them to engage in some high intensity or pretty high intensity stair climbing. And then at the end, so we're kind of resting heart rate, and then this is either the control or you do the stair climbing, depending on the visit. And then at the end, you do the cognitive and mood testing. And it's the same 3 cognitive tests I talked about, and also the same mood scales I just talked about related to that mass study. So there were the 6 moods, and we just checked how their mood was after the cognitive testing in relation to whether they just done the stair climbing or not, whether they just engaged in the exercise. Now, this is pretty much what the stair climbing looked like. We had 3 1-minute intervals of fairly intense stair climbing, but we did ask them to prioritize safety at all times. So they're supposed to go pretty much as quickly as they could, but not risking safety at any point. We didn't want anybody falling. And what you see here is heart rate going up. These are the 3 1-minute intervals. At the beginning, they just did a little bit of warm up, like walking back and forth, just a little warm up. And at the end, they do a little bit of cool down. But the whole thing's only about 10 minutes. And the actual exercise part's only like 3 minutes, basically. And what we found was after the stair climbing compared to the control session, yes, there were some cognitive improvements, but they were only in the males. The females didn't improve, which was surprising because most exercise cognition studies, if anything, show a little more improvement in females than males or the same. So it was quite weird to see only males improving on a cognitive level. When it comes to, and they only improved for the hardest test. So that more challenging test where they had to do the mental flexibility or switch back and forth between the green and the red squares. In terms of mood, though, we saw benefits irrespective of sex. So people felt more energetic and less tired after the stair climbing compared to the control visit. And they also felt less tense. So that was quite encouraging, given, at least at University of Otago, anxiety issues are becoming more and more prevalent. So it's good to see that just a little bit of exercise actually seemed to be helpful, irrespective of sex. But we're really interested in getting those cognitive benefits. So we decided actually maybe that wasn't enough stair climbing. Maybe 3 1-minute intervals isn't enough. So we decided to double it. So we decided to run another randomized control trial. Only this time they're engaging in 6 1-minute relatively intense intervals, just like what I told you. And you can see that heart rate by the end is a bit higher than when they only had to do 3. Also, because we thought there could be sex effects, we included 26 males and 26 females and analyzed by sex to see. But actually, this time there weren't sex effects. So males and females alike showed cognitive benefits. And that was particularly for the most challenging task. So it wasn't restricted to males or females. There was just at a group level improvements that was not moderated by sex. And we also saw some mood this is the effect sizes. So looking across the tests, the basic visual motor tasks, the inhibitory control tasks, and the switching tasks, you see the effect size going up. So this is partial eta squared. And for the hardest tasks, you have quite a large effect size. So I think 0.14 is generally considered large for partial eta squared. So it was a nice, healthy, large effect size for the hardest tests, but more of a moderate effect size for the inhibitory control tasks. That's easier. And then in terms of mood, in contrast to the cognitive benefits, we didn't see even stronger mood effects, but we did see mood effects. So they did feel more energetic, even after 6 relatively intense 1-minute intervals of stair climbing, and they also felt happier. So that was good, even though they had to go a little bit all out and they would have been a little bit tired, you'd have thought. We still found actually that they were reporting they felt more energetic and happier, so that was good. We then decided, okay, that's great. Things seem to be going pretty well with the young adults. How about older adults? As I said, it's actually older adults who tend to have more difficulties with negotiating stairs and also are showing more cognitive decline, so stand to benefit more. So we decided to target people age at least 65 who could, of course, go up and down stairs. Not everybody can at that age. And what we found was, yes, some evidence of cognitive benefits, but no mood benefits. On the contrast, they actually felt more tired. So they didn't have any mood elevation. Instead, they felt more tired after that, which is perhaps possibly indicative that doing 6 1-minute intervals is a little too much for older adults. It's possible that they would be better off with 4 or something, but I'm not sure. Okay, and then finally, this study that we've just run, and I don't have all the data analyzed yet, but we decided, okay, we'll go back to young adults and we'll check whether we're getting global increases in blood flow following the stair climbing, because we had an idea for an intervention study, which I'll mention in a second. So we wanted them to do the same thing, the 6 1-minute intervals. But in order for us to get all the brain recording equipment on, as you can see here, it took about an extra 20 minutes. So we weren't sure if we would have missed the benefits of the stair climbing or not. And I don't have all the data, but I can tell you the cognitive results. And I can also tell you the near-infrared spectroscopy results from the forehead, like we talked about before. So from these 2 forehead sites. We also had EEG, but I don't have that data yet. And so what we found is, yes, there were still cognitive benefits. In fact, there were cognitive benefits for all 3 of the tests now, which was great. But we didn't see any mood benefits. So it seemed like the cognitive benefits are a little more enduring, but the mood benefits are perhaps a bit fleeting, and we missed it as far as I imagined, even though I can't prove that. But there were no mood benefits. We also saw some indication of increased brain blood flow volume indicated by total HB or total hemoglobin. So sorry, this is the cognitive results shown visually. And you see that this is reaction time difference, and a positive bar indicates that they were better for the stair climbing session compared to the control. And you can see that it was significant for all 3 tests. And there's no indication that the benefits is going away necessarily by the third test. So that seems a little bit more enduring, the cognitive performance benefits. But for blood volume, unfortunately, the increase was only during the first cognitive test. So the near-infrared spectroscopy data recorded from the forehead sites only indicated an increase in total HB just for the very first test, which suggests to me that there probably was an increase that we pretty much missed. And although I guess it's nice to see something, what I hope to be able to do is to actually pair the global increase that you get from stair climbing in terms of brain blood flow with targeted electrical brain stimulation. So we could target that area in older adults that they use for compensatory cognitive function in hopes of boosting their cognition further. But now I'm afraid that by the time you get to the electrical stimulation, it's possible that the global increase in brain blood flow is not enduring enough for us to tap into that and then to focus some of those benefits to a particular area, namely the anterior part of the frontal lobe. So I'm not quite sure if it's worth moving on to the next study in older adults. Although it could be the case, because their vascular system changes, it could be the case that the increase in older adults might dissipate slower. We're not sure. It's possible that older adults don't have that global increase dissipating so quickly as possible. Okay, and just a quick plug for my PhD student who's still back in New Zealand and working on, she's interested in endometriosis in women, and in particular, women who have chronic pelvic pain with endometriosis. And she's interested in how that's affecting their cognition and also the functional organization of their brain. So she's trying to first characterize the cognitive difficulties. We know that they're having cognitive difficulties based on self-report, but they haven't been characterized objectively with objective cognitive tests. So we're trying to characterize that, and she already has some pretty clear data suggesting there are cognitive difficulties, not surprisingly, given that they self-report difficulties. And she's then trying to also identify brain markers that she could potentially target as she develops interventions to try to help people who are suffering from chronic pain with endometriosis. And just a quick thank you everyone for coming, and certainly to participants, funders, and all my student collaborators. Quick plug for New Zealand. We have lots of beautiful mountains for those of you who want to come and have a look. Or you can come and see one of our mountain parrots, Kia, but you have to climb really high because they only live really high. And I also want to say thank you for allowing me to look at your mountains. It was very beautiful. I was so surprised to walk straight out of a city and be in the mountain. Very nice. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for your enlightening presentations. And according to your presentations, I can understand about the related topics. And also, I tried to make some exercise in the future. Yeah. So we just want to open a Q&A session for all of you guys. And also not only for the on-site session and also in the Zoom, we can collaborate all the questions and ask her questions. And we can make a deep conversations between you and the speaker. So if you have any questions, and raise your hands, and then our staff will go to, and you can make a question. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation.
Bye.
Yeah. Actually, you showed us that the Korean students, middle school and high school students, their physical activities level is very low. Yeah,
Right.
so I would like to know, you showed us the relationship between physical activity and brain functioning. And so my question is, what do you think of the relationship between brain function and academic achievement in school?
Yeah,
So yeah.
Again, I don't study children, but I think it's true for university students too. But there's some clear data coming out now that regular physical activity is important for better academic achievement. I think there was a time, I think there was a time when we didn't understand that so much, that we thought study, sit down, study, keep studying. But now I tell my students, study for a little while and go for a walk up a hill and then study some more. Get your brain blood flow up. And they're finding with children that their academic achievement is better if they exercise regularly. So I think school systems will start to change. One thing I didn't mention, it's not my area, but it's of interest and of some relevance, I guess, in Seoul, is air pollution can be an issue. Exercising, of course, heavily in air pollution can take away some of the benefits. So people do have to be a little bit careful. Try to not to exercise right beside the traffic if possible, where the air is a little cleaner is better. But I think they're realizing now more exercise for better academic achievement. Yeah. And maybe work as well. You know, like if you exercise it, for those of you who go into jobs, I guess some of them, you will go into like a desk job, and maybe you're sitting all the day. You may find that you really need to get out and get some exercise during your break rather than just sitting and drinking tea, or it's maybe better to get some exercise. Hi.
Hi, I have a brief question. I actually have two questions. One is about adulthood and one is about aging. For adulthood, I'm curious about, because I often have the experience of I go out for a walk or I go up a really steep hill and then I feel more energized, but then I sit down at my desk and I can't really concentrate, especially in terms of visual attention. So I was wondering, are there any mechanisms that relate to that? And my second question is about aging. So it was mentioned that for adults, for aging adults, physical activity is particularly helpful for their cognitive functioning and enhancing their cognitive functioning. I was wondering if there are any particular exercises that are especially helpful, because it seems like different exercises lead to different body use as well as mental function.
Yeah, I'm going to touch on that first and then go back to the high intensity, if that's okay. So another thing that's really good for older adults that I didn't talk about is social interaction. And so engaging in some physical activity that involves maybe socializing with some friends can be a really good idea for maintaining better cognitive function. Also, as you said, like if you think about, okay, what are my options? I'm going to do some exercise. I can go to the gym and maybe it's very repetitive. So you're not really engaging many cognitive circuits. It's really quite motoric, the same thing over and over again. You don't have to think about it because it's just a treadmill or something. Just keep moving. I'm not saying that's not good. That's good. But engaging in some more cognitively demanding exercise of some kind, you know, maybe out in the real world where you have to worry about obstacles or, you know, interact a little bit more and think a little bit more, you might find that that's a little bit more beneficial still compared to just a repetitive exercise. In terms of the high intensity you talked about, some people do find that if it's quite high intensity, sometimes the benefits are actually a little worse. Like it, you know, like it's as the exercise gets stronger, it's good, moderate. And then with high intensity, some of the benefits are actually lower again. And it could be that you're pushing yourself quite hard and then you feel tired and not actually as engaged. So it's possible that the exercise you want to do during your work day, like to just get your blood flow, is maybe a little bit lighter if you're finding then you got to your desk and you want to go to sleep, or you don't feel engaged with the work. But I think most people would find if you engage in some exercise, even just a brisk walk during your break, that you may find yourself actually more engaged when you get back. But there is a point that sometimes it's too much.
Is there any other question?
I have one question. I have one question that might be slightly off topic,
Okay.
but I'm still curious about it. as you said, when people age, they experience cognitive difficulties, right? And exercise can alleviate those problems. And
Can help, yeah.
yeah, it can help. And what about the meditation? Because I'm curious that is it as effective as exercise?
Like blood pressure medication?
Yeah, kind of.
I don't think so.
You don't think?
I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not giving medical advice or anything, but my feeling is because in New Zealand, a very high percentage of older adults are on blood pressure medication. Actually,
No,
I know
no,
you didn't say it
I mean,
correctly.
just not blood pressure meditation. I mean, just meditation, like mental meditation.
Oh, meditation.
Yeah, meditation.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm very sorry. I did not understand. Oh, meditation. There is some. I've only ran one study related to meditation, and I don't have a particularly positive result from my own lab. But there's data out there that suggests meditation can be very helpful. My feeling is from the literature that a good combination is the best idea. You know, like even though I just said, well, maybe if you're just on a break from work, you might not want to do all out exercise, like a really steep hill and you're kind of tired after, but you should still, if possible, do that on some other days when you don't need to go back to work. You know, and also meditation can be very relaxing for the mind in a way that can really help people on a cognitive level. So I think trying to combine these things, mild, moderate, intense, sometimes exercise, just sometimes, and also meditation is a very good idea. Yeah. Yes. And even though our diet randomized control trial didn't work so well, there is a lot of data out there suggesting that diet's also very important. I mean, you really need a good vascular system, which means, you know, like a lot of fruit and vegetables, not so many donuts, you know, to keep the blood flowing nicely and supporting your thinking. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. In one of our questions in the Zoom, he asked that, could you explain why you choose the pro and anti-cognitive task method? And he just wanted to ask one more question, that given that we engage in conversation and thought, he was curious about the importance of immediacy and speed in this method.
And the importance of immediacy and speed. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So the task that we chose, we wanted to keep it relatively brief. My background was actually in eye movements. When I did my PhD, I was studying eye movements, and I studied the anti-saccade task, which is something where something appears suddenly and you have to suppress reflexive eye movement and try to look the other way. So the truth is I developed those tasks out of my personal background, but the main thing was to try to get tap a couple of executive functions and have kind of like a control task that just involves the basic vision motor function. So not really any cognitive control involved. So we can see the comparative difference as the task gets harder. So that was kind of the main reason. We could have done a large battery like we did for some of the other tests, but then it takes a long time. And if you're trying to catch acute effects that might not last so long, we thought we'd just stick to a few tests. In terms of maybe, I'm not sure if I understand the latter question, but like one thing you might think about, so about the immediacy, it's like, how fast you can respond to things and process things and respond correctly, how you need to, you know, is so important in many of our tasks. It's important in a conversation for good social interaction, but it's particularly important like if you're driving a motor vehicle or doing something where if you're a little slow or you make a mistake, you might crash or somebody could die. In some cases, these can be very important, you know, for survival, but in many other cases, it's really about interacting well on a social level and being able to enjoy your day, you know, being able to think fluidly and well without having too many struggles.
Okay, so one or two more questions? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your impressive lecture. And I have one question. And my question is related to variables of executive function.
Executive function?
Yeah, we have recently begun research to develop tasks to measure cognitive abilities in adolescents. But we are having some problem deciding what to consider as the measurement variable of executive functions. So, because actually, according to your lecture, you measured variables like inhibitory control or mental flexibility, right? As a-
Inhibitory control and mental flexibility, we have done the most often because it's like 3 short tests that are easy to fit in. But we also have a lot of selective attention and other tests, which have relevance. But the truth is, in designing, my background is in designing cognitive tests. And as you get more and more complicated on a test, it gets harder and harder to interpret the results. And the results can get quite messy. So sometimes having a short test that doesn't tap too many things, like you can interpret it better. What was affected here? Okay. I understand what they're having difficulty with, can be quite useful.
Yeah. So, but what about the higher order executive functions like planning or problem solving, like that? So, can the results of measuring only relatively lower state of the executive functions can be defined as overall EF capabilities?
I think if there's plenty of there's plenty of studies out there. It's not my area, but looking at things like creative thinking. So much more complicated tasks where you have to come up with creative ideas, and showing that engaging in exercise beforehand, even like walking, can mean that you come up with more ideas and better ideas for creative thinking. So although my lab doesn't study it directly, I think there is plenty of data out there that it can help quite complex forms of cognition as well, that might seem more directly relevant to a particular job task. You know, like if you're doing advertising or something, you have to come up with different ideas, then creative thinking is really important. It's true that for these tasks, it's really getting at the basics that are part of many tasks. You know what I mean? Like juggling between things, different task demands, that's like part of every day all the time, mostly, you know. Even if you're just eating, you know, usually, well, you've got your drink and your food and maybe you're having a conversation and you have to juggle all the task demands, you know. So it's like a simplified aspect of it without the complexity of all the other things going on, kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just give me a warm applause for our distinguished speaker. Yeah, Dr. Machado. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. 네, 오늘 참석해 주셔서 너무 감사드리고요. 추가적인 정보는 여기 홈페이지나 유튜브, 인스타그램을 통해서 확인하실 수 있습니다. 네, 감사합니다.